Hi everyone, this is Jerry. This is a game from the Pro Spring Chess Tournament 2010, round 5 game between Carlsen and Topalov. Carlsen with white opened with 1 e4. Topalov responds e5 and would quickly enter Ruy Lopez, indicated by this bishop b5 move. a6, bishop back, knight f6. This is all very standard stuff. White castles, bishop e7, and now d3. This is the first not so common type of move out of the Ruy Lopez. Instead, what's most common is this rook to e1 move, which would lend support to this e4 pawn, and then white would likely implement the following plan: c3, and with correct preparation, pawn to d4. We're not getting into that, and the reason I'm thinking we're not seeing this is because Carlsen is maybe wanting to avoid possible lines out of the Ruy Lopez, more specifically the martial attack. Topalov is a very aggressive player, and so it would not be a surprise to me whatsoever if he went for the martial attack. How would that come about? If rook e1, pawn push, bishop back, black could castle, and if now c3, black could lash out in the center with d5. This indicates the martial attack, offering a pawn in exchange for pressure against the white king. We would see moves like c6, bishop here, queen out, etc. So as to avoid that sort of line, we're now seeing instead this d3 move, adding a defender to e4, and also just allowing this bishop to see a bit more clearly. And now white is getting ready to just chop on c6, followed by grabbing the pawn on e5. So that's why we're now seeing b5 opposed to a routine move like castle that would lose a pawn. So b5, bishop back, and now d6 supports black center and allows the bishop to see along this diagonal. a4 puts an immediate question to this b5 point, and this is the first point that I'm finding pretty interesting because of how black goes about responding to this threat of simply winning a pawn. Since this rook is unprotected, white is getting ready to simply capture on this square, and black wouldn't be able to recapture as a result of this rook being unprotected. So how to go about this threat right here? We really don't want to capture away from the center. That releases some control of the more central squares. We don't want to really capture away from the center if we don't have to. The move that was played is rook to b8, but a good question to ask yourself is, why not maybe make a move like bishop b7? What's the big difference between the two? You could reason that the bishop is now developed. The bishop is on the longest diagonal it could possibly be on. So what's the big difference between rook b8 and bishop b7? The reason that I'm seeing rook to b8 is played opposed to bishop here is because this bishop is going to want to play the role of watching over this very critical square f5. When you play the Ruy Lopez enough, or if you're acquainted with it, you'll note that one of the journeys that one of the white pieces makes will be this knight that's on b1. It likes to take the following journey: d2, f1, g3, and from g3 it likes to sit on this, it likes to get to this f5 square. So the bishop is going to want to just stay on this diagonal, in other words, so it could take out that knight if it ever lands on that f5 square. You really don't want a knight in your position. If you're playing the black side here, this is your side of the board. So if you're going to allow your opponent to just sit one of their pieces on your side of the board, you're really starting to ask for some trouble, because from f5 there's just multiple possibilities. You could anticipate the black king being castled in on g8, and if this knight is on this f5 square, from there's two different squares he can go to, which would be checking. Namely, could go to h6, go here at some point, or who knows, there's just some crazy sacrifices. What it's coming down to is you just don't want to allow your opponent to have one of their pieces in your territory. So that's why we're seeing already at this very early stage this rook to b8 move opposed to bishop here. So takes, and now knight to d2. It's on its way to this g3 square. Black castles, rook e1, vacates f1 for the knight. Bishop d7, nope, it's staying on this diagonal. And now since these guys are connected, a move like rook to a8 is possible so as to contest the only open file. c3 is supporting this d4 advance. Rook a8, let's contest the only open file. Since white really can't connect the rook, since the queen can't watch over this rook here, white has really nothing better than to just exchange the rooks. Queen takes, and now d4. Pressing forward in the center, putting pressure on this e5 pawn. h6 is a preventative move. What is it doing exactly? Well, it's essentially allowing this rook to move a bit more freely. I mean, if this rook were to move right now, this square is vulnerable, and you may very well see a move like knight g5. And both the bishop and knight are converging on this f7 square. So h6 simply watches over this g5 square, so we don't see knight g5 coming into play. And now knight f1, the bishop can now see clearly. And again, g3, here he comes. Rook e8. Black is doing similar with their king rook. By moving it over one square, they're vacating the f8 square, just how white vacated the f1 square. Knight g3 eyes the f5 square. Queen c8. The queen is also participating and watching over this f5 square. And now knight to h4. So this is a very key square in the Ruy Lopez when we have this sort of maneuvering type of thing going on. One other way to kind of meet the idea of white plopping their knight on this f5 square, sometimes you would see this type of regrouping, given enough time, a move like bishop f8 and a move like g6 would be played so as to watch over this this type of knight move, but there's no time for that right now. In fact, if a move like this is played, we could just grab it because this pawn is pinned to the king. So there's no way to really watch over this f5 square anymore from this point. So black has to just kind of get in position to maybe tolerate a knight on that square. So the bishop retreats, allows this rook to watch clearly or support this e5 pawn directly. And now knight to g6, taking advantage of the weakness that was made as a result of this earlier h6 move. This pawn is pinned, and we are ready to now see an imbalance in the position. And by an imbalance, I'm referring to maybe the exchange of a knight for a bishop, or a change in the pawn structure. In this instance, we're going to be seeing an exchange of knight for bishop. So knight a5, knight takes bishop, rook takes knight. There's no time for black to grab this bishop. White in the end will just go into Pac-Man mode, essentially just grabbing all these pieces, grabbing this guy with check. If something like this comes about, black is just going to lose. So that's not happening. So that's why we don't see knight takes here. Instead, just recapture immediately. And now the bishop reacts to the knight's threat. So the big thing that just occurred is this the imbalance that occurred was the knight for bishop. So how to really go about the position from here? Since we have, as white, the bishop pair, what you're going to want to do is open up the position. How do you do that? You offer pawn exchanges. So let's see how Carlsen from this point tries to open up the position. Rook e8, the rook only wanted to come here to make a recapture, so let's get it back here where it's doing something a little bit more useful. f4, let's offer pawn exchanges. Let's try to, as white, overtake black's only center pawn. e5. Bishop g4 hits the queen. Carlsen just moves out of the way, and at the same time forms this battery here. So there's already possibilities for, if black can't maintain this pawn on e5, white can press forward, and then who knows, the queen might jet down to h7. Pawn takes and bishop takes. I'm not sure really what would be better from this position. It's going to be a little bbit awkward if black has to maybe recapture on this e5 square. If we see a couple captures here, we could see the knight coming in here. It's very, very scary looking from this point. In fact, you may very well see queen takes pawn at some point. I guess black was reasoning that it's better to just give up their only center pawn and just fight the battle that way. So we have takes, and now knight to c4. hitting b2, how to react to that threat. A knee-jerk reaction to this sort of move might be to just do a counter-attacking move, like b3, like pretty much saying, oh, you're going to attack me, I'm going to attack you. The downside to that is knight a3 could be played, and now this bishop is going to be gone, either by a knight's capture or the bishop's capture. Wherever this bishop goes, it'll be recaptured, and black would benefit as a result. When you have the bishop pair, your opponent will likely try to exchange one of those bishops off the board, so you should try your best, especially if it is an open position, to maintain that bishop pair. So that's why we don't see this b3 move, because knight could simply come here, but instead the bishop just tucks itself back to c1. Goes back to its home square, but notice from its home square it's serving a good role, watching over the base point and essentially boxing. I didn't mean to grab that. From here it's essentially boxing out this knight. Where can this knight go in a forward motion? Wherever it goes, any of these squares right here, the bishop is watching over it essentially. So the bishop is boxing out the knight, and it's on its home square, but it's still developed. It's striking from its home square at d6. It's staying out of the rook's view. It's not in any piece's way. The only reason you would want to maybe have it off of this c1 square is if maybe you had a rook on a1 that wasn't able to come into play, but obviously there's no rook on a1 from this point. So this is a very harmonious setup here for white in this position. The bishops are really just beautifully placed on c2 and c1. The rook is great on e1. It's supporting this advance, and white is ready to really just get ready to push black off to its 9th rank, which simply doesn't exist. It's really just getting ready to push the black pieces off the board. So how do things work? c5 strikes at the center, but I really don't see what more there is to do here. I guess black is trying to crack at this pawn. Maybe there's some check against the white king. As long as Carlsen is careful in this position, I think it's just already well beat. This bishop pair in an open position and at this high level of play is going to prove very difficult to try and even pull out a draw. So rook to f1. Already there's tactics involved. The rook changes its place from e1 to f1. Why exactly? Well, there's possibilities of probably either one of these moves in many variations. So just getting it on this f file is better than keeping it on the e file. Pawn takes, and now queen to d8. Watches over this knight to avoid this possible tactic. And now we have h3. So these next couple of moves are essentially get out of my house type of moves. These two pieces right here are the only pieces that are in white's territory. So let's just kind of get them out of there, and then we'll make some more forward progress. So h3, you could reason, is kind of like a multi-purpose move. It's like, all right, get out of here, bishop, and at the same time I'm going to shift my king to h2 if need be. So the bishop backs up, and now b3. We just want this knight out of here. Black ignores that and instead plays queen to a5. And one nice thing about this position is that white could actually go for this sort of variation right here and still be winning. If we had this sort of situation going on, this would still be a very strong position for white. Well, maybe not winning. It'd probably require still a lot more work, but there's no need to even complicate matters. Let's not get into too crazy of an imbalanced position. Let's just, instead of going for pawn takes knight, let's just try to improve our position a little bit more. King to h2 says a lot about this position. In an open position, typically you're really going to need to make each move count. There's usually more aggressive type of moves than this king to h2 move, which is completely prophylactic. It's just safety move. Let's get my king out of any potential checks, maybe along this diagonal at some point. And it's really just saying to Topalov at this current position, what do you really have? and I really don't see anything for black in this position. That's not to say that there is something, but it just really looks downhill. I mean, this knight is hanging. The only way that this knight can still stay here is a result of this bishop, you know, keeping a close eye on it so that that skewer would come into play. But to be in that sort of situation is just, you really don't want to be in that sort of situation where you're just having your own pieces there to just recapture, so you have one tactic in store. So what we do see is knight to h7, retreating the knight so as to maybe avoid again potential sacrifices. You could again see the knight getting chopped, or even the pawn at some point. e5 opens up the diagonal towards the black king. g6 to defend. How else is there to really defend from this position? We're just getting ready to just win a knight. So if knight here instead, we could see a move like knight h5, adding more fuel to the black position. I mean, if we just do a quick piece count, if we just look at the numbers in this position right here, what do I mean by numbers in this position? I'm talking about the aggressive pieces, the attacking pieces, versus the defensive pieces. How many defenders are there for the black king, really? Probably just this bishop and this knight. This rook, maybe in some variations, but it's really just too much to really tolerate. You have all the white pieces focusing their attention on the black king. So that's probably what would occur if we saw this knight move, just the knight here, and there's possibilities for just the queen coming to g3, mate threat. And you'll note that when the queen does come to g3, then this idea of grabbing the knight on c4 would also be a threat. So just really downhill from here for black. We don't see this knight move, but instead g3, more weakening going on. This pawn could be taken at any point, but the game finishes up very nicely in the following way. d5 hits the bishop, and if the bishop reacts to that threat, we're just going to grab this knight. So Topalov plays knight takes, and the knight is hitting the queen, but guess what? This position is so strong for white, can just ignore that, give up the queen, pawn takes bishop, and from here black ends up resigning, and for good reason. If knight takes queen, we just have pawn takes, nice little fork going on here. King here, we don't even have to take the rook right away. Bishop takes check, king here, pawn takes rook, the whole house is falling. King takes queen, bishop takes knight. This knight is just very sad, and this queen is very lonely. She really can't do anything to even harm the white king. These two bishops are really going to cause black some more problems. In fact, this knight is probably going to be lost very soon anyhow, in lieu of bishop takes, g6, forking the king and knight. But as it went in this game, after knight takes pawn, pawn takes bishop, black ends up resigning. So that's all for this video. Hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.